Anthony, thank you so much for taking the time to join me to talk about your upcoming book as we're recording this, Jolted, Why We Quit, When to Stay, and Why It Matters. Thanks for having a productive conversation with me today.
Absolutely, Mike. Thanks for having me.
So, right out of the gate, one of the things that I noticed as I was going through the book was this idea of what a jolt was, right? So, in the book, you say a constellation of factors comes together to create an event that knocks us out of autopilot, and these are called jolts. And we're going to talk. These events are called jolts. We're going to talk about the different types of jolts. But as soon as I read that, it reminded me of when I was working in the private sector. And I've worked in the public sector a bit too, living here in Victoria, BC. But I never thought of them that way. Like I've always thought of you talk about push, pull, and then, like these different events. As someone who coined the term the Great Resignation, and you've seen a lot of this stuff, what was the kind of jolt, for lack of a better term, that led you to say, hey, this is what this is. This is a bit of maybe not an anomaly, but this is a phenomenon that no one's really exploring.
Yeah, there were probably a couple things. And one was, you mentioned the Great Resignation. I think that term caught on for a number of reasons, partly just good timing. But I think it was a term that captured how a lot of people were feeling, but it wasn't being talked about. And they didn't really have a word to express the sense of, I'm not sure that I want to go back to work the way that it was before the pandemic. Like maybe there's something else that I want to do. And that Great Resignation tapped into that feeling that people had about work that I think was right below the surface. Now, the reason I predicted the Great Resignation was in part because the pandemic was filled with these jolts of different types. It could
Hmm.
be jolt from looking on the nightly news and seeing the health crisis that was going on. It could be jolts from realizing that your employer, who said that you could work remotely, wants you to come back into the workplace. And so, but part of the reason I predicted the Great Resignation was because there were all these jolts, but of course they were sort of bottled up because the labor markets were so stagnant during the pandemic. Now, fast forward, we're well past that, 5 years later, and it still seems like workers are trying to express how they're feeling as the world changes really rapidly, but lack a little bit of a vocabulary for it. And so I wish I could take credit for thinking of the term or coining the term jolts, but both the terms jolts and shocks are used somewhat interchangeably in my favorite area of the academic research on turnover, where this neat discovery was made that, a lot of the times we quit our jobs because they slowly become less and less pleasant for us, and we slowly make the decision to leave, and it's very logical. Sometimes there's outside greener grass that attracts us into another role that slowly becomes more attractive, and we think through it. But what we've discovered over the decades is almost half the time you can point to a single event that says and say, that's where it changed for me. My relationship with work, that's when I started to think about leaving. That's when I did leave. And we see these jolts. We'll talk about them. We see them everywhere. But what's been really neat for me is as some of my friends and family have been early readers of the book, in my conversations with them since then, and this just happened to me last night, where somebody texted me and said, "Anthony, I just experienced a jolt,
Yeah.
and going to lead me to leave my job." And so I think it's nice. It gives us the shared vocabulary as workers, as humans, and as leaders to talk about these events that come for all of us at multiple times in our career and lives.
Well, and what's interesting is the types of jolts, one I never really even thought of before. So it's not just the jolts that happen. You're like, oh, I see this. This is a jolt. But they're like, wait, this is a jolt. So there's been a few that as I was going through the book I recognized. One of the things that you bring up early on is the post-jolt balancing act, right? So this idea that you'd think sense making, if you were like actually in a world that was slow or slower, like COVID, like during the pandemic, where we were kind of in this, we'd slowed things down and the world was still operating, and now we're ramping speed back up, which we're going to get into a little bit because I think that's definitely a factor here. But you mentioned that we would be able to have some form of reflection that we'd be able to do in that period, right? Instead of just kind of reacting, we would be responsive to it. So, but the best thing is, you said easier said than done. So for somebody who's experiencing a jolt, First off, obviously they're going to have to recognize it, like you pointed out. But why the propensity to just react instead of reflect a little bit? Like, how does someone flip that switch in a simple way to say, okay, hold on, I've just experienced this. I'm going to take a beat and think on this, as opposed to have a knee jerk reaction or something of that nature.
Yeah, part of it is as simple as reminding yourself that doing nothing is a good option, maybe the best default option. And these jolts, they can be fairly subtle, or they can be pretty intense, but they often carry with them a bit of an emotional charge. And we don't do our best thinking when our emotions are mixed up with our thinking. Usually, it's helpful to recognize our emotions and think about why we're feeling that way, but also then, think on the cognitive side, what are my options here? What should I do? I think especially when it comes to quitting, and I was thinking about this, during the Great Resignation, everybody was talking about quitting, and everybody who was quitting was saying, I'm a part of the Great Resignation. When in reality, there was plenty of quitting that would have happened,
Yeah.
anyway, just how the economy works. And so, but what has been great about over the past 5 years as a culture, we've become much more comfortable talking about quitting, people posting a lot about it on social media. It's commonly covered by the media, but it can give you the impression that it's fairly easy, quick to do, and doesn't have career lasting consequences. And so I think this balancing act is pretty critical to not fall into the temptation of making a career altering move too quickly. Like in most cases, you have time to work through this sense making process. It's not the original sense making research was studied during emergencies. And although that can happen sometimes with jolts, often there's time to figure it out.
Right. And often in those emergency situations, the triage portion is assigning, not doing. It's like, you go over here because this is where you're going to get the best thing, not happening it's kind of like managing your to-do list from your email inbox. Like, it doesn't make any sense. Speaking
Yeah.
of email and office and that kind of stuff, in chapter 4, you allude to a movie that I rather enjoy. And I look at it from the perspective of Peter, right? As opposed to the Jennifer Aniston character.
Yeah.
Office Space. When you watched that movie, you must have been like just leaning in, right? Especially in the line of work that you're doing, like, because there's so many things in it that are very overt, but also like a greater message underneath, right?
Yeah, I think that that movie is one of those ones that perfectly captures really, not too caricaturized version of how a lot of us experience the world of work and the decisions that are made, in the world of work. And yeah, I do talk about in the book, that whether whether you call it quiet quitting or leaning back or neglect, that is often a good option in the wake of jolts. And yes, the fact that that strategy ends up benefiting Peter so much is pretty spot on, I think, sometimes.
But it seems preposterous. Like, the fact that like comedy works with this, like, it's an extraordinary event under ordinary circumstances, or ordinary, like the way it works, you're like, you cannot, like, literally nod your head and go, yeah, like, of course this guy, like, he's got a devil may care attitude, and they love that. Like, I love the cut of your jib and all that. And of course the outside consultants come in. It's really fascinating to kind of watch that. I've watched that movie a number of times. The other one he did, Idiocracy, is a whole other movie that we could probably wax on, because I think both of them may appear to be a bit of a documentary at this point. But I want to talk about. Go ahead. Yeah.
I would just say, like, I do think it's interesting, the devil may care attitude, and you talk about idiocracy, and we see this is a lot in the leadership, research right now, is that we can, narcissism or this devil may care attitude, we can think like there's no way that these tactics are actually successful in the modern world of work when we are, we're organizational scientists, we're driven by people analytics. And I think why these movies connect so much with people is they can point and say, I know that person, like
Yeah.
that person exists in my organization. So yeah, both modern day classics.
Before we jump into the jolts themselves, I want to refer to an article that you were interviewed for. I think it was CNBC. This is in 2022. where you predicted the Great Resignation, and then you shared 3 trends that you thought that would dominate 2022. And we're now well over, it's 4 years plus. So one of them, I'll go through all 3, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, because I think it's directly correlated to the book itself, right? Like, obviously, some of the stuff that you saw that did come to fruition is in here, but then stuff that maybe didn't. So number 1, you said the Great Resignation will slow down. Number 2, flexible work arrangements will be the norm, not the exception. That's getting a little bit muddy, right? And I don't think it's because of, I think it's because of, again, performative productivity, office space. There's a perfect example of that right there, right? Like, if I see you working, then I know you're working, but are you? And then, so we'll touch on that in a minute, but also remote jobs will become more competitive. Again, it's almost as if I feel that the world is trying to spin back up to the way it was before. Like, we got to get back to where we were. We have these, I think it's also second order thinking. We have these office buildings that were vacant for so long, and we paid for leases, so we need to get you back in here. But we're going to say it's in the interest of productivity, and not in the interest necessarily of, well, we've got overhead that we've got to cover here. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on what you said back then and where we're at now.
Yeah, I was probably a bit, we'll say optimistic on how much these institutions are willing to change, or maybe you know, maybe I didn't recognize enough how these institutions are difficult to change, and
Right.
so I knew there was pressure to go back to the way that work was. I don't think I anticipated it continuing for this many years. I definitely didn't see. I'm not an AI futurist or anything like that, so I didn't see a lot of the pressures that would be stressing out white collar workers these days, and helping to move them back into the office. Now, that being said, so I don't think those predictions were spot on. I do think, though, now, work continues to be the more flexible than it's ever been before, than it was during before the pandemic. If you think about, there was just like a huge snow day in New York.
Yeah.
You know, normally, before flexible working, before we all knew how to just hop online, it would be that a bunch of people stayed home from work that day, took a snow day, whatever it was, a non-working day. But now it's like very easy to say, oh, you just flex. Or, and even in offices where everybody has had to come back to the office, there's still much more flexibility around, I need a day here because my kid has this thing I need to be at, or whatever it may be. So there is better flexibility, but the percentage of the jobs that are remote, the percentage of the jobs that are hybrid, has dropped since that 2022 interview more precipitously than I would have anticipated. And I, yeah, I don't think I've ever seen a justification for in-person work that really provides a strong evidence-based case that this is performance is why we want people back in the office. It's
Yeah.
always a nebulous concept like culture or innovation or teamwork, but no actual evidence that shows that being physically present drives innovation or drives culture.
Well, I think one of the things that happened with remote work or hybrid work is that night owls like me were able to actually structure their days in a way that served them, as opposed to the 9 to 5 or 8 to 4 or whatever. And so there was that too. So it is interesting, and it's constantly evolving. And one of the things that when we get into the jolts themselves, chapter 5, you talk about direct jolts, and I've looked at my history with Costco, because that's where I came from. And Costco is a very good company to work for. I'm going to preface it by saying that, they've always been really good. I just had lunch with a friend who's been there for well over 30 years now. And I mean, lots of things have changed. But one of the things that happened when I was there was I was a manager in the food court area, the hot dog soda area. I also ran the service deli for a while too. But during my last times as a manager, I was in the food court. And we had an employee who was having issues, and we couldn't figure out. She was great when she was there, but it was few and far between. So my manager said, "Look, you need to schedule extra people and assume she's not going to be coming." And I said, "Okay, fine." So I did that. And he said, "I will explain to head office why your payroll is a little higher." It's because if she did show up, what are you going to do?
Yeah.
Long story short, she started when she did show up and so on and so forth. I think about 2 months in, I got called in, "Mike, your controllables are, you're like, you've got to fix your payroll." I'm like, "But you," and it became like I should have got it in writing kind of thing, but that wouldn't have mattered either. And you talk about challenges and stuff, like there's so many, but that to me felt like it was a direct shot at, like, it just shattered everything. And
Yep.
I got very strategic about how I stepped down, which I loved as I was going through this. I'm like, oh, okay, well, this is how I did it. I actually convinced the person who took over in the service deli she said, "Oh, I need more help. I need more help." I'm like, "Post a part-time job. Like, it gives you flexibility with payroll." As soon as she posted it, because I had seniority and all that, I went, grabbed it off said, I went from full-time manager to part-time employee because the jolt was like, to me, it was that big that the trust was broken. So this is now where there must have been a series of jolts there as I talk about it. It wasn't just the direct jolt, right? Like, as I'm explaining this to you, does it sound like it's just like a jolt kind of thing that's going on? Or was it one that just kind of, they had already happened and this one just cracked everything open?
I mean, to me, that sounds like a fairly classic um, direct jolt. Not to say that there wasn't undercurrents of smaller jolts, or this wasn't a straw that breaks the camel's back. But, I talk about this a little bit, and we can get to honeymoon jolts later. But this whole
Mhm.
idea of, like, it's interesting that you said it's one of those things I should have had in writing, which is like a written contract versus what I talk about. We have these psychological contracts, and you were
Right.
working off the psychological contract. Like, my boss says that they're going to have my back. I take it for granted they're going to have my back. And then you get into a situation where, boom, they do not have your back. In fact, they just pushed you under the bus, And so that is that moment where you said it, trust shattered. And, trust is hard to build and easily lost. And once that's gone, um, yeah, that is the event of that, like, psychological contract breach where the expectations I have of my employer, this is an example of them absolutely not being met. And, you know, I think that's, speaking of flexibility, I mean, I think that's fantastic that you were in a position where you could not necessarily quit, but pivot from that full time to part time. And I wish there was more part time employment out there, because I think that would be a way that a lot of people, a very healthy way for a lot of people to deal with jolts, in a way that still benefits the organization but takes care of themselves as well.
Yeah, it was interesting when it happened. They were surprised, but it was a pleasant surprise because they're like, "Oh, well, we're going to get this person who already knows how to do this. So he's going to help out this department. He's not interested in running this other area anymore. So we're going to get somebody up there." So it was a win-win-win across the board. The only thing I had to do was obviously make up income on some other levels. But for me, it was about agency. It was like for the longest time, and you get into this a bit too with the idea of you're working extra, you're putting in the extra mile, you're doing all that stuff. That was it. Like, and that jolt deteriorated all of that to the point where I'm like, I don't want to be a full-time employee. I want to be a part-time employee that they have to ask to stay late, and not a full-time employee who says, "Can I go home early?" So I was really all about you. You had taken a lot of my time and life and energy and all that. And very much I was saying, no, no, no more. And this covers quite a bit of the stuff that's throughout the book too.
Yeah, and it's one thing if you're putting a lot into your job, going above and beyond, putting extra hours in, and then it's coming back to you in some way, whether that's like social capital, where you have more leeway and leverage and effectiveness in your job, or actual capital, so you're getting compensated for it. But it's when you're going above and beyond, or you have over years and years, and you think, it's okay because I'm covering for the organization and the organization covers for me. And then the organization doesn't cover for you. Yeah, it's completely a trust violation. And the very natural reaction as human beings, we work on these exchange relationships. And you realize this exchange relationship is completely out of whack. I've
Yeah.
completely overinvested in this organization that's not investing back in me. I need to make an adjustment. It's very logical.
I want to circle back to 2022 as we talk about the honeymoon jolt, because in the book you've talked about how late 2021 and early 2022 represented the peak of post-pandemic quitting. And then later in 2022, after your interview, by the way, it was a little bit after that, headlines began appearing with some variation of the following message: the Great Resignation has become the Great Regret. What, to me, that, like, what's the correlation there? Because I think a lot of, like, is it people that either they spent, like, so as I thought about it, and especially in the context of what we're just talking about, I spent so much time doing this and I regret it, versus I regret quitting, or I regret, like, to me, there, I'm not saying it's nebulous, but what why that transition? Like, what led to that, do you think?
I mean, for me, there's a kind of a not very exciting answer to it, and that's we've often known that quitting and regret go hand in hand, and
Mhm.
part of that regret comes from we underestimate the things that we like about our current job, but a lot more of that regret comes from these honeymoon jolts, or what's known as the honeymoon hangover effect, which is that we look at our current situation and the grass doesn't look very green. We see all the brown spots on the grass around us, all the problems with our current job. We look at this other job, this other chapter that we're going towards, and we mainly see the upside. We're thinking positively. We mainly see the green. We get over to that new role, and we realize that, like, after a few of these psychological contract breaches where our expectations were that they were going to let us not work on weekends, but they're asking us to work weekends, or, we thought the flexibility was more flexible than it was. And you realize, wait a second, I made this big change to upgrade my, well-being, my career satisfaction, my schedule, like whatever it may be, and I find myself in the same situation. And it may be that, like, I left a job where I liked 70% of it and I disliked 30% of it. And
Yeah.
I've actually solved that 30% that I didn't like, but there's a different 30% or 40% that I don't like in this new job. And that's where the regret comes in. It is where you say, I thought I upgraded and it didn't shake out that way. And I, I dwell on it a little bit in the book, but, like, some of the research that has been done around this effect of, like, when we enter a new job, we're really excited and we're seeing the green grass. It's the honeymoon period.
Mhm.
Then a few of these things happen and it becomes more of a hangover. So some of the research that has shown that, like, in almost the majority of cases, where on average, after people make a job change, they're not as satisfied in their next job as they were in their prior job. I think there's a lot more going on than these
Yeah.
averages, so I don't want to spend too much time on that because a lot of people do upgrade, and I'm a fan of doing that. But that's where we go back to, in the wake of these jolts, being balanced, thinking a little bit slow, and working your way through it to make sure that if you do quit, you're actually upgrading in the way that you want. And 6 months from now, you're not sort of shaking your head saying, I'm in the same place I was.
We've touched on several of the jolts already that seem to have a negative component to it, but there's positive jolts too, which it's interesting. And I mean, I'm imagining it was orchestrated this way because the brain goes negative first. You even bring this up, like, they tend to go dark before they look at the light. So the positive stuff comes later. And you've actually taken them, if I recall, and kind of saying, okay, well, let's elements of these are like positive direct jolts, positive, like it's almost like the adjective that further describes it. So are these rarer, do you find, or, like, to me it seems like that pause that we mentioned, that liminal space between, like, this is what happened and I've got time to reflect, and, oh, this is good. Like, is that where the positivity comes from, or is it almost overt right out of the gate?
Yeah, often it's over right out of the gate. And I mean, the sad part is positive jolts are more rare than negative jolts. And that's not to say positive events are more rare than negative events, right?
Right.
Hopefully our lives have more positive events in them. But positive events, again, like you mentioned, there's a psychological effect where it's like the positive negative asymmetry effect, but it's just the bad is stronger than good effect. When something bad happens, it catches our attention more than positive things. We dwell on it longer. We anticipate that it's going to lower our mood for longer than a positive event will elevate our mood. So there's all these reasons that we sort of zero in on things. And keep in mind, negative events are also this aversive signal that something needs to change,
Mm.
which aligns with the notion of jolt. Often, positive things that happen are a signal to keep going, like things are going well. Like
Yeah.
failing at work, you're like, I may need to change things. Like I just failed at work. Getting a pat on the back at work could make you think. It probably just makes you think, boy, I have a good boss. I have a good situation. Now, it could be a jolt. You could think to yourself, I am really good at this job. Maybe I should go out on the market and see if I could get a better, an even better one. So,
Yeah.
so these positive jolts sort of reside in all the same places. They're just not as common or powerful. But when they do happen, they do have the power to fuel these epiphanies, these really big positive revelations that we have. So I think they're pretty cool for that reason.
Well, and taking a step back, we talked about leaning back already, maybe again from that space of the office space thing where it's like it's not necessarily a good thing. It's actually could be considered a form of quiet quitting or what have you. But one of the things I loved when you talk about this there's a couple things. Number one is getting crafty with your extra job tasks. And this speaks to me as somebody who is adamant that you cannot manage time, but you can craft it, right? So to me, when it's like, hey, what if you can create the job you want from within the job you have. You just, again, I think this requires this stepping back idea, right? To say, okay, well, how do I do this? That leaning back. And we live in a world that's so much like I better lean in, right? So
Yeah.
when I read that chapter, I'm like, there is a lot in here that we don't take into account because we assume that, oh, if I'm leaning back, it means I'm disengaged.
Yeah, and the default is powerful in our lives. We often, the job that the organization gives us is the job that we're given, and we don't give ourselves the agency to question, like, could I either by myself or with my manager challenge some of these tasks that I've been given? Do they really need to get done? And if you're, in the wake of a jolt, you're trying to figure out what is the sustainable way forward for me and my well-being, it's worth questioning unquestioned beliefs you have about your workload, your work-life balance, and so forth. And so this definitely goes for thinking about, we were talking about earlier with you at Costco, all the different ways you go above and beyond the call of duty. You help out your coworkers even though you're not paid for it. You arrive early, you stay late, you maybe answer some emails on the weekends, like whatever it may be. And so
Mm-hmm.
if quitting it isn't an option or you don't want to quit, a natural place to rebalance your relationship with work lies in these extra job tasks. And so really questioning, and you might need somebody to hold up the mirror for you, often a partner or a good friend or who, somebody who knows you well can say, what are the things that you're doing that are not a good use of your finite resources and time?
One of the other things you bring up in the chapter, which I love, is when you mentioned LeBron James, I immediately thought, oh, he's going to talk about the naps that LeBron takes before. but I didn't realize, and then I took some time to actually watch some highlights. He walks a lot. You are right. Like, and this isn't, people are like, oh yeah, he's old now. I'm like, no, you can see he did that before as well. Like it's a very deliberate, and this lines up with me in terms of like this idea of productivity where it's this activity of producing. So it's go, 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 fast, 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 now, as opposed to let's be in this state of producing, the state of productiveness. Because what he's, the idea of these pockets of energy, how does someone, and again, this is all part of leaning back, how does someone find ways to short circuit this, like you said, the defaults that say we've got to keep going, we've got to got to push. I'm going to sit at my desk and have lunch, or I might skip lunch or skip my breaks, or that sort of thing. And LeBron James, I mean, look at what he achieved as a basketball player. Like, that's performance, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think if you look at what you're actually doing when you're working through your lunch break or skipping your lunch, if you look over the course of your day, you're going to find that you're probably taking breaks out of necessity in dysfunctional ways, or the tasks that you're doing are taking longer than they should because you don't have the cognitive resources to push through. And so again, and I'm guessing, LeBron has some scientists working with him to back this up. But that the article I pulled that statistic from was from earlier in his career. I mean, he was very early on figuring out, um, how do I, within a game, save these pockets of energy? But what's interesting now is that we still see him as an all-star, as deep into his career as anybody's ever been, playing at that level. And I would guess that's partly because of the cumulative walking he's done during these micro breaks over the course of his career. It allows him to keep inflammation at bay, or whatever it may be. And so I think, we can take a lesson, and there are lots of, you mentioned naps, but like a quick step outside during the workday, just a change of pace, a change of scenery, get these resources and energy back up. A lot of the hybrid workers I talked to, coming out of the pandemic, were saying like part of the reason they like working from home is because their back garden is right there, and they can pop outside during the workday, get refreshed, and come back in. It's this natural sort of inclination I think we have to gravitate towards micro breaks in between tasks. But when we're in the office and there's tasks everywhere, and the culture of busyness is there, we sort of short circuit maybe those natural inclinations that we have.
I love how the end of the book gets into like, okay, here's what happens as you get ready to quit. Like, you're like, okay, all of this happening, this is how it's going to happen. And when I got into chapter 13, recently, Eric Dane, who played McSteamy on Grey's Anatomy, passed away. And there's an episode and I think it's like the season 9 or something like that, where he's got all this energy and stuff. And everyone's like, he's recovering. And one of the doctors is like, no, this is the surge. And you actually mentioned thinking about quitting power surge. It got me there. I'm like, he's like, I'm ready to go. I was like, oh, wait, no, this is the beginning of and it to me, I felt that way when I actually left Costco. Like, so when I fully left, I was like putting it in. I was like, I wanted to finish the way I started with Costco. So it was very much. And then as that happened, I found myself, well, maybe I shouldn't have. Like, maybe like it's that weird that. So when someone's facing that, that's number one, that's got to be tricky. Number two, how do they recognize? I mean, it's already too late in their mind, right? And they know it, but it's quite an interesting phenomenon you bring up.
Y- Yeah, I think we're so focused on the reasons for quitting, and the negative side of quitting, that it's very natural that we don't think about that we're almost instantly going to have a little bit of homesickness for certain parts of our
Right.
job. And all of the little annoyances that you have in your work go away when you know this is the last 2 weeks you're going to have them. This is the last 2 months that you're going to have them. And you move into this strange savoring mode that can feel like maybe this is actually sustainable. Now, of course, if you actually end up sticking around, you realize those annoyances are back in your life forever. It'll all come washing back while you were leaving. But I do tell people who are preparing to quit, like, be prepared for this ambivalence of like excitement and nervousness and looking forward to your next chapter, along with some nostalgia, homesickness, and these other feelings. They're all going to come at you together. And it can make you question whether you made the right decision or not. But that's why you did all the work earlier in the book to know that you made the right decision. Um, the power surge that you mentioned um, is pretty fun. It's when you realize that there's been this power shift where for the most of your time working for an organization, they have the power. That's how most
Yep.
of us as workers exist. But as soon as you realize I've made another plan, I don't need this anymore, it can make you feel like, oh, this is like a good time for me to tell the organization what I think about them. I have a little
Yep.
bit of power. How am I going to use it? I said we're motivated as humans to get even, to rebalance things. And so that's where some some self-control, I think, goes a long way. Or, this where you maybe type out an email and then saying how you feel and then hit the delete button.
As opposed to
Or
what Greg Smith did, where writing a whole op-ed for for the, there is this, and you're right, it's become that's become a phenomenon that you see a lot. Like, I'm publicly quitting, I'm moving. Like, it's the, and I'm a Gen Xer, so like, I'm like, you don't have to announce that. Like, an Irish goodbye is fine. Like, we don't all need to know that you're quitting. But I also know, especially when you see these things on LinkedIn and Facebook and such, it's a double prong message. Normally, it's I'm leaving and I'm open for opportunities. So you're putting it out there in that regard. But I mean, airing dirty laundry, I mean, especially in the world we live in now, and especially as you alluded to earlier with the advent of AI, I think you've got to couch that a bit like you talked about.
Yeah, and most, you're hoping to move on to a better employer, or something positive next. It just doesn't reflect well most of the time. For your next chapter, to end your prior chapter on a sour note. If you talk to most HR professionals and say, who's your ideal employee to hire? It's somebody who's happy in their current role at wherever they are and aren't bad mouthing that organization. And hopefully we can draw them away from that good situation that they're in, as opposed to what we really go after are the disgruntled employees, like who are really dissatisfied in that role. And then we bring them over. No, I mean, nobody wants that. And so I think it's important with everything that you do during your resignation, especially if you're going public with anything like this, is to be really honest with yourself about what you're trying to accomplish here. And if it's a little bit more social media traction, it's probably not worth it. I in the book I say, there's probably only a few situations in which it's worth airing dirty laundry. And that's, I mean, if you have a truly toxic, awful boss and you're getting out, but you're leaving your friends behind,
Right.
maybe then you do a skip level and you tell HR or you tell your boss's boss, look, part of the reason I'm leaving is because this. And I think you'll lose more people if you don't address that person. But yeah, most of the time, silence and a little bit of honesty and a lot of silence goes a long way during this process.
As we wrap up, I want to share kind of the one of the big takeaways I took throughout the book, which I don't know if it was what you intended, but as you know, when you pass a book on to a reader, you don't necessarily get to decide what they take away from it. So,
Yeah.
in the surfacing jolts as they happen chapter, you bring up Clayton Christensen, Innovator's Dilemma. You talk about him there, and it got me thinking. That was the thing that I saw carried throughout the entire book, of this idea of, and I've said this before, and I have a colleague of mine who teaches leadership and then has relationship, like he's got a podcast where he talks about this stuff. And I thought there's a distinction between a manager and a leader, right? Like, I remember, and speak back to the Costco thing, before I got promoted at Costco, I was really good at all the, quote, as they used to say, hard skills stuff like that. And the reason I was passed over for promotion at least 3 times was you don't have the people skills. You don't have the interpersonal skills yet. You are literally one of the best infantry that we can have, but you're not going to be able to lead a team. So for somebody who is on the other side of this, they run an organization, they look at this and they go, oh, geez, yeah, well, I mean, I can't control the jolts. I know they're going to be there, but how do you create that distinction between and that growth from I'm a manager and I'm going to manage things to being a leader, to kind of cultivate that environment where, these jolts that happen, they don't turn into things that end up sabotaging your business or your workforce. If anything, they're things you learn from.
Yeah, I think you had part of the answer when you said, creating the climate, and it's this environment where jolts are going to happen. I'm as a manager slash leader not going to be able to detect these, and so how do I develop a culture, a system by which people, when they experience these jolts, feel comfortable surfacing them, or going back to that crafting, feel comfortable talking to me, voicing how they would like to craft their job in the wake of this jolt. So there's been a lot of talk about psychological safety, and for good reason. Like it drives a lot of positive behavior in the workplace. I think the other element that often gets discussed, and I think rightfully so, when it comes to the difference between leaders and managers, is setting a vision for this image of where we're going as a work group or where we're going as an organization. We're trying to go to this more positive place, and often that more positive place is how is this work group going to have a positive impact on the lives of other people. And I think it's really helpful if you're a leader who's crafted and has put in people's minds a really appealing vision of the future. Because then when you have those jolts, when your employees have those jolts and they say to themselves, is what I'm doing at this job really meaningful? Are we doing anything important? Yes. Like, I mean, if you have like a leader who's created that vision, the answer is right there for you. But too often we're in that space asking ourselves, does this matter? And if we don't have a leader who has really given us that answer, or at least given us part of the answer, that's where the jolts can really move into. I need to do something else where there's a little bit more meaning, a little bit more satisfaction.
One more quick question, because this comes up a lot when I'm talking to people who say, I'm tired of my job, but I can't quit. And I say, well, no, you can. Like, you can quit. I mean, there's nothing stopping you. Oh, well, no, I have a mortgage. I have this, I have that. Okay, we'll sell your house. Like, I provide like the alternate. And so it feels like there's no agency for them to leave their job when in fact there is. It's just they are choosing not to. How, how does, how do you, I mean, obviously the book, which we have here, will prepare people for this, but how do you kind of help people recognize that, yes, in fact, you can quit, like you can leave. You will have to make some tough choices around it. But I think the default is, I can't quit. I've got all these things. Like it almost feels like for some it's a trap, but there's the door's open. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's funny. I thought about this before. One of the individuals who endorsed the book, Kim Scott, who's wonderful. She wrote Radical Candor. Uh, Part of her endorsement was the best quitting advice I ever got was don't forget to quit. Like we often think it's not an option for us, and so always remembering that it's on the table. And I think um, part of the goal of the book is to slowly or quickly walk through these different options that we have, but we will get to a point where it's time to quit. And that's when you really have to come face to face with those different barriers you put up for yourself and say, how serious am I about how serious am I about charting this course, this path toward the good life? Because you often talk to individuals who say, I should have quit sooner. Like I waited too long. I spent 3 years or 4 years or however long in that job, 20 years in a job that I shouldn't have. And so if you're serious about increasing, your job satisfaction and your life meaning, a lot of that for many of us comes from our work. And so if you're in the wrong work, you're never going to get there. So if you remind yourself of that, I think then it helps you take, I mean, it is often a very scary step into the unknown. So, it takes a little bit of a nudge to get a lot of us there much of the time.
The book is called Jolted: Why We Quit, When to Stay, and Why It Matters. Anthony, where can people pick up the book, and where can people keep up with the work that you're doing?
Yeah, the book is for sale at all major booksellers, March 17th in the US and March 19th in the UK and elsewhere in the world. And I'm mainly on LinkedIn. So link in with me there. You can find me there, and I post anything I have there. So thank you.
Anthony, thanks for having a productive conversation with me today.
It's been my pleasure, Mike.